Good morning. This will be our final regular class day. The next class we have will be our final. Whether or not we're going to do that live or somehow pre-recorded, I have not yet determined, but right now I'm leaning towards live. Excuse me. However, for right now, this is our last day. You should have a paper that says Newburgh and Victory in front of you that came with your email. Excuse me, boy, I have water with me. So when we left off, we were talking about Yorktown, the aftermath of Yorktown. One of the things I started to tell you, but I don't think I actually got to, was we talked a little bit about Martha Washington's son, George Washington's stepson, Jackie Custis, who had become an aide de camp, even though his mother wasn't really sold on the idea. She had managed to keep him out of the war for the entire war, but Washington finally convinced her that he would be okay because he'd be an aide de camp. He actually catches camp fever while he is there at Yorktown. He does not survive. He dies a couple days after the final surrender of the British. So Washington doesn't get to go directly back with the army. He doesn't really participate in this big celebration. He ends up going to first the house that the Lewis house, I believe it is, that his stepson was being looked over at. I'm not sure I said that right yet. Was being looked after at, and then of course the funeral and all that had to be arranged back at Mount Vernon before rejoining the army. Now, you will hear if you type in on your machine that you're looking for the last battle of the American Revolution, 9 times out of 10, you are going to see the answer come up that it is the Battle of Yorktown, which just isn't true. I mean, it's the last really major battle, and it was certainly a decisive battle, but they don't know that yet. Again, the English King George III, says, we've lost an army, not the war. We're going to continue to prosecute the war. And in 1782, remember this, Yorktown, 1781 September. In 1782, there are, and this is your first answer, 71 battles, 71 more battles. And there are people and that's just in and around the United States territories. There are still battles going on at sea. In fact, most of the battles that are going on at sea turn towards the British side, and really, the British make they make up some ground in 1782. It looks like they could be turning the fight back towards their direction in 1782. And then truly the last battle of the American Revolution isn't fought on American territory. The last battle that's connected to the American Revolution, because our French allies were fighting against the British in the Battle of Cuttador, which is in India. I mean, if you think all the way in India, of course, England had a long-term interest in India for their trading. So again, we see something that's kind of the understood and expected, not really the truth. There were people still fighting and dying for the cause of American liberty, even in 1783. In fact, after peace had been declared is when the Battle of Cuttador occurs, because they hadn't gotten word yet. They didn't know that peace was official. And so anyhow, I was going to say, so that number 2, though, is after Yorktown, Washington moved his army to, and the answer is Newburgh, New York. Newburgh, Newburgh, New York. It's a place that he is secure, the army is safe, but they can keep an eye on New York and they can get ready to attack. They can go back to being on the ways of looking for some way to move the British out of New York. Again, New York, the last major stronghold of England in America at that point, if you don't count the Canada territories, which of course we never will see become part of the United States. Here Washington really wants to get them out, and so that is largely, again, his focus. In the meantime, the French army went home to France, and to other battles, other places, and the French Navy had moved on. They were headed to other battles. The Spanish are still fighting. In fact, the last battle to occur on what would be the continental United States happens in what is today part of Arkansas, and it's called the Battle of Arkansas Station. And that's where the Spanish are fighting against the British on our behalf in the American Revolution. So that's, even more strange when you think about those final battles. But again, we're losing Americans too in different battles and skirmishes throughout the South and even up into the New York area through 1782. I said after Yorktown, they moved to Newburgh. And your question number 3 is in March of 1782, Prime Minister North, you remember Lord North, who was, you saw plenty of pictures of his very round face. He lost a vote of no confidence in Parliament. On March 27th, 1782, Lord Shelburne, the second Marquis of Rockingham, which I just have on your paper as Rockingham, became the new Prime Minister. And he immediately began a push for acknowledgement of the independence of the United States. This is a drastic change. Now, Rockingham had been in the minority, just like we have in the United States today. We have 2 major parties. At that time, they had more parties, but the 2 largest parties were the Tories and the Whigs. So Rockingham would be a Whig, and he had spent at that point, I think it was 16 years as leader of the minority party in Parliament. So he wanted to see peace made, and he wanted to see an acknowledgement of the independence of the United States. This meant that Parliament was now going to, who holds the purse strings, right? They've got the money. They're going to tell King George, no more. We've already lost enough. This has been almost 8 years at this point. It's 7 years, but they're going on to their 8th year. They've sent soldiers. They've sent supplies and money, and they've lost a lot, including 2 armies. And so they're saying, and largely the will of the British people had said, let's be done with this. Now, King George is not an unpopular king. In fact, for the most part, for England, he's an exceptional king. He is truly a kind of that bridge into the more modern age. He's their first English-speaking king with English as his primary language. And he actually, until he has issues later in life, some people will tell you that, the Mad King George, well, he was not experiencing any mental illness at this time. And his papers actually just recently have been opened up to us as researchers, and they reveal a very complex man, but a man who was a very strong thinker, and except for his issues on American independence, usually pretty much on the side of right. So anyhow, well, of course, it started with American liberties before American independence, but I digress. The Continental Congress appointed a small group of statesmen to travel to Europe and negotiate a peace treaty with the British. They were John Adams, and then the blank there is Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, and Henry Lawrence. Now, Henry Lawrence had been an ambassador that had been out before he'd actually been captured by the British. He spent time in the Tower of London, only American to ever spend time in the Tower of London. So he'd been there. Now at this point, he'd been to Holland and helped negotiate for money to be given to the Americas. We'd actually traded him. We'd gotten him out of prison for General Cornwallis. But now they're sending him back to England to negotiate. And Thomas Jefferson. Also, Henry Lawrence is the father of John Lawrence, Washington's aide-de-camp through a good deal of the war. One of his really sharpest and best, and a very strong anti-slavery voice in Washington's military household. Because of that, he is one of the people, along with Lafayette and Alexander Hamilton, that we really hold responsible for kind of altering the way Washington's point of view. When Washington started the war, he thought we shouldn't be arming slaves because they're likely to turn the guns on us. By the time we get to the end of the war, he's not only acknowledged that some of the bravest soldiers he saw and some of the most heroic actions he saw were by people who had formerly been enslaved. But he has decided that we really need to find a path to eliminate slavery, that it's no longer really not only is it not viable, but he recognizes it as morally unsupportable. So at any rate, again, I do tend to tangent, don't I? Thomas Jefferson, you believe you've heard of. John Jay will become a very, very famous person in America. He will be on the Supreme Court once we have one, which of course is still some distance off at this point. John Adams, who we've dealt with many times. And Benjamin Franklin, the esteemed Dr. Franklin. So these are names that are famous. Maybe Henry Lawrence the least, but that's a shame because he's an interesting founder in his own right. 5. Colonel Louis Nicola wrote a letter to George Washington. Is that all that I put down? That's very funny if I didn't put anything else down. Did I not put that as an actual question? Let me look at the paper here. Opening. All right, so I think I did in here. Oh yes, wrote a letter to George Washington. I did put it down as a question. My sheet's a little different than yours. On May 22nd, 1782. And this would totally be, you're like, who's Colonel Nicola? And why do I care about him? This is a really interesting letter because they don't believe that Nicola was acting alone when he wrote it. They believe that there were several people that actually asked him to write it. And among the things it says is, this war must have shown to all, but to military men in particular, the weakness of republics. Remember, they've been fighting. They've got the Articles of Confederation. They have formed a republic. This is a government with a republican form, small r, not political party republican, but a republic type of government. So he says, this war must have shown to all, but to military men in particular, the weakness of republics, and the exertions of the army has been able to make by being under a proper head. Therefore, I little doubt. So again, the army, has done well under its proper head of you, General Washington. Therefore, I little doubt when benefits of a mixed government are pointed out and duly considered, but such will be readily adopted. In this case, it will, I believe, be uncontroverted that the same abilities which have led us through difficulties apparently insurmountable by human power to victory and glory, those qualities that have merited and obtained the universal esteem and veneration of an army would be most likely to conduct and direct us in the smoother paths of peace. He's telling Washington, so you've led us really well, and I think we've shown that a republic is not very viable in the long run, and gosh, you'd make a good leader. And then he says, some people have so connected the ideas of tyranny and monarchy as to find it very difficult to separate them. It may therefore be requisite to give the head of such a constitution as I propose some title apparently more moderate. But if all other things were once adjusted, I believe strong argument might be produced for admitting the title of king, which I conceive would be attended with some material advantage. Yeah, he just told Washington that he thinks that we should probably have a monarchy and that he should be king. This letter was met by Washington with saying, no, that is the furthest thing from my mind. Please don't ever speak of it again. However, think about all of history And when people have been in a position of power, like Washington is at the head of an army that is now seemingly victorious, because we're starting to hear talks of peace coming out now. You know, he's seen 2 armies have been defeated. He has led through 8 years of war. People are saying the Congress is totally ineffective, but Washington, he's effective. He gets stuff done. Maybe we should form a government around Washington. Why not make Washington king? And this is not Nicola's not the only person to think this. And so putting it to paper is kind of testing the waters to see if Washington is interested. Throughout history, very few men have been able to resist an offer of, but you know, maybe you should be king. In fact, it's kind of a joke that in the United States, all the senators wake up every morning, look in the mirror, and hum "Hail to the Chief" just to see if it works, which I think is a great image. But it's very true. You know, people who are in a position of power tend to want to augment that power, make it more. And after all these flattering words, Washington's response is, no, that's not what we're doing. This is what we're about. And so he holds true to his convictions. However, there's some other problems brewing. And that includes number 6. In 1780, backtracking a little bit here, Congress had promised half pay. Had promised to, I'm saying this wrong. In 1780, Congress had promised continental officers. They promised continental officers a lifetime pension of half their pay when they were discharged. When you leave the service, you'll get half pay for life. That's what they promised in 1780. Of course, the problem is, and that's number 7, by 1783, most officers had not been paid in 2 years. They'd gone 2 years without payment. So it's great, you know, Congress says, hey, when you retire, you'll get half pay for life. Well, which half pay is that? Is that half of what I haven't been getting for the last 2 years, of half of what I'm supposed to have gotten? And does Congress even have any money? So there's a real anger brewing. Now, we saw on the way to Yorktown, the soldiers who hadn't been paid in a long time demanded to be paid in gold before they marched any further. And because of the Comte de Grasse, was it Comte de Grasse? No, it was Rochambeau, General Rochambeau, loaning Washington money, they were able to continue. And now we have a situation where the officers have said, you know, we haven't been paid either. And so this is a brand new problem. The 8 is the Congress had tried to pass legislation to have a tax that paid the soldiers and officers, but the states could not come to a unanimous agreement. Remember the Articles of Confederation. They say specifically, if it's not a unanimous decision, it doesn't happen. And how often does Congress come to a unanimous decision? It just doesn't happen. It didn't happen in the Congress then either. So the Articles of Confederation, again, showing their weakness as a pure republic as they're thought of at the time, without much central power. This is a real danger because they can't get an agreement, so they're not getting any more money. 9, the officers knew that peace was being negotiated. That says negotiate instead of negotiated, but oh well. And were concerned they would never be paid. They began to discuss the possibility of marching. And this is where most history lectures and all get it wrong. They think that they were going to march on Congress. They weren't. The suggestion was that they marched to the states, because remember, each one of these different companies and units and divisions of the army, they all come from individual states. You've got the first, you've got the Continental Army, but you've got the 1st Virginia, you've got the 3rd Connecticut, you've got the 5th New York, you've got all these different, different companies of dragoons from Rhode Island. So they were going to march against the states, bypassing Congress because Congress is too weak, and basically pushing Congress aside and going directly to the states and saying, if you don't pay us, we're marching against you. Now, basically, that would be throwing out the Congress as government. And I want you to think about that for a second, because here we fought now for 7.5 years, almost 8 years at this point. And this would be a counter-revolution. This would be a military coup where the military rises up and takes power. They'd be seizing the reins of government and going and demanding their payment from people. So you would have essentially a military dictatorship. Very counter to the principles that they've been fighting for. But remember, some of them have been fighting all this war and promised time and time again by this government. And now they're saying, you've got to pay us. They're angry. And of course, Washington has urged them to be moderate, to be calm. And they actually start sending out letters that say, that you should not listen to anyone who would urge moderation. And they're speaking directly to Washington. They're speaking directly of Washington at that time. And they're telling the officers, Washington's not on your side in this. And even though Washington had time and time again begged Congress to please make sure that these men were taken care of. So on February 12th, General McDougall sent a letter signed with the pseudonym Brutus. Now that's interesting, because if you think historically, and you know that the people of the 18th century, they did love their history, especially their military. People loved history. Brutus is the name of the man who led the assassination of Julius Caesar, who had become a tyrant. So that's the name that McDougall chooses. They don't know at the time that it's McDougall that writes it. Sends it to General Knox. Remember, General Knox is high up in the army, being commander of the artillery, suggesting the army might have to mutiny and refuse to disband until it's paid. See, this is the deadline they're looking at. They're saying the Congress wants to disband the army and send them home. But if we go home, we're never getting paid. We need to take action before they disband us, or refuse to disband us, and make sure that we get paid, we get this before we leave. Because if we leave and go home, why would they care? We're not a force. But right now we're still an army together. We're a force. We have power. So refusing to disband until it is paid, specifically told Knox not to make any direct steps, but he should not lose a moment in preparing for these events. In other words, prepare your men, prepare the minds of your officers that it's time. We're going to have to take action into our own hands. February 13th, there are rumors that a preliminary peace agreement has been reached in Paris, and it heightens the sense of urgency. They start going, if we don't, we're going to have to get on this really quick. Now remember, that's just a day after what we had just seen. So General Washington the same day essentially, actually Alexander Hamilton writes a letter. Alexander Hamilton has now left the military completely. He's now in Congress. He's a congressman. And he sends a letter to Washington urging that he take the direction of the Army's anger. And Washington responded that he sympathized with both the plight of his officers and men and with those in Congress, but he would not use the Army to threaten civil government. Remember, Washington has always considered himself to be under the civil authority. That they're the authority, not him. He is the servant of the Congress, which means he's the servant of the people. Now this is a situation where they're saying, you take direction. Alexander Hamilton's in Congress. He's basically telling Washington to put pressure on Congress by using the Army. And Washington, of course, says no, he's not going to do that. He believes such a course of action would violate the principles of republicanism for which they had all been fighting. On the morning of March 10th, an unsigned letter begins circulating in the Army camp. I think this is in our paper here. Yes, it is. And if I didn't, 9 there, the officers knew that peace was being negotiated and concerned they would never be paid, they began to discuss the possibility of marching against the states, is the answer there to number 9. 10. On the morning of March 10th, an unsigned letter began circulating in the Army camp. Later, it was acknowledged to be written by Major John Armstrong, Jr., aide to General Gates. You guys remember Horatio Gates? We haven't seen him since the Battle of Camden. He hasn't held an actual field command since the disastrous loss at the Battle of Camden. But if you recall back, he was part of the Conway Cabal that wanted to replace General Washington with General Gates. Here, again, Gates is in this position of trying to remove Washington. The letter decried the Army's condition and the lack of congressional call for a meeting of case lead this revolution against the Congress and against the states. So General Washington is very aware of what's going on, and he looks at the situation, and he puts in his orders for the day, asks that the meeting be moved to March 15th, and that he be notified of the findings of the event. So what has he done with this delay? Okay, something to think about here. No one, Washington never writes about this. We don't really find out what the inner workings of his mind are. But again, we just saw that General McDougall was putting himself down as Brutus. March 15th, that he's moving the date to, is the Ides of March. It's famous for being the day that Caesar was assassinated. It's the day of action against tyranny. What an interesting date that was chosen. He also says very smartly that he expects that he will be notified of the findings of the event, of the meeting. Whatever they decide, he wants to be notified of. Which means, of course, he's not going to be attending. You're going to have to come and tell him what happened. Which is all a bit of brilliant because... So the answer there for 11 was March 15th. All a bit of brilliant because on the 15th, when the meeting happens, it happens at a place they call the Temple of Virtue. And there's a reconstruction of it today that you can go see. It's at Newburgh, New York, right near the headquarters. All right. So General Gates had just begun the meeting when General Washington unexpectedly arrives and asks if he might address the officers. So everyone's there, they're gathered together, they're just about to get this meeting rolling, and then all of a sudden Washington, with his aides, shows up and comes into the meeting unexpectedly, last person they expected to see there, and asks if he can address them. Well, of course he can address them. He's General freaking Washington. So yes, they let him in to address the audience. And he begins to give what he feels is an impassioned call to please not abandon the cause at this point. He speaks about what Congress is trying to do. He's trying to talk about what's been going on, how he's been making efforts, and please, we've struggled so long together. And it is falling on deaf ears. The officers are ticked, they're tired, and they're scared, basically. One of the things you can always usually count on is when you see real anger, there's always fear behind it. If someone's really angry, it's because they're afraid of not having control over a situation. They're afraid something is going to happen. They're afraid someone's going to get away with something unjust. It can be very righteous anger, don't get me wrong, but fear is definitely the stepping stone to anger. If someone's not afraid of something, they usually aren't angry. Here he walks in and he's trying to make this plea, and it's not happening. They don't care. And so he decides he needs to read a letter from Congress on what's being done on their behalf. And he pulls out the letter and he starts to try and read it, and then he can't. He can't actually read the paper. And so he reaches in his pocket and he does something that they have never seen him do publicly. The only people who would have ever seen this would have been his close aides or his wife. He pulls out his glasses. They've never seen him wear glasses. And he says, "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I have grown blind as well as gray in the service of my country." And he puts his glasses on. And that was the reminder that they needed. That was the moment that they looked at him and they realized he'd never left them. He'd always been there. He'd given as much or more than they had. He'd stayed with the army from the beginning. He'd never taken a leave of absence like every other general had. He'd never gone away. He'd always been with them, and he had served for 8 years. And he didn't need to. At that moment, the officers, these battle-hardened veterans, began crying. And the vote was basically taken off the table, and this event disbanded without deciding to become another revolution, without becoming a military coup. Now, if you look just a little further down the line, you can see the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is one where it's one revolution and then another group revolts against the people who are in charge, and then another group comes over. It becomes the reign of terror, where they keep executing the last batch of leaders. Undoubtedly, a military coup would have led to a military dictatorship, which would have led to, if not outright resistance by other parts of the states, it would have been a great opportunity for England to come back in, sweep back in, and just say peace is off the table. We're going to come in and regain control. In fact, a lot of states, if the army was marching against them, a lot of states probably would have said, England, well, you take us back so that we can fight off this new foe. And they would have, so we would have either seen this entire war go away for having been for nothing, or we would have seen a series of revolutions and the complete breakup of the states into being what they had thought themselves to be before, which is independent countries. Certainly you wouldn't have seen the success that was to come. So very interesting moment at Newburgh, New York. One that doesn't make the same amount of history as the battles, the Yorktowns, the Lexingtons, the Saratogas, but probably in some ways more important than a lot of them, or at least equally as important in deciding the fate of the nation that would come. So that was the last threat to American independence. It actually came from our own officers, or if you want to look at it that way, the ineptitude of Congress and how they dealt with them. But going forward, it wasn't too much longer until you get to May, when General Washington meets with Sir Guy Carleton, because the preliminary peace has been established and set on, and they're finalizing negotiations. And so he begins to negotiate with Sir Guy Carleton to release prisoners and to establish how they will evacuate North America. And after their meeting, Sir Guy Carleton invites Washington and the governor of New York, which is Governor Clinton at the time, on board his ship. And they're on board his ship, and as they're coming aboard, they're given a 17-gun salute. And as they leave, they're given a 17-gun salute. And this is a signal to say, that we are acknowledging that the heads of a foreign army are coming on board and are departing. Not, no longer is he Mr. Washington. They're acknowledging him as General Washington because they are acknowledging the independence of the United States of America. So that's even a big deal in its own way. Washington will remain at Newburgh until it's time for the handover of New York. He eventually, the day comes when there is supposed to be the switch off, the trade off where the British are leaving New York and the ships are pulling out. He stays at the Bullhead Tavern that night, and he rides into New York with Governor Clinton and other dignitaries and his army, which has been reduced down. A number of them have gone home now. And again, this is the victorious army that's marching into New York. But there's a report from a woman that says that she saw this army coming into New York, and this army, they've been occupied for essentially 7 years at this point. And they were looking at this and they were saying, we've seen an army march and drill and look sharp and crisp. This army doesn't look like an army. This army looks ragged. Their uniforms are tattered, if they have uniforms. And this is, remember, not just any of the soldiers. This is what's left. This is the forces that Washington kept for this switch off, for this trade off. And they come in and she says that, they didn't look like an army. And at first it was shocking to think that these were the men who had liberated New York. And then she said, we realized what they had essentially been through for all this time. And they were more dear to us than you can imagine, because this was our army. And already there's that ownership, that change in mindset of going, what does it mean to be an American? And so they march in triumphantly. They have dinner that night, and there's actually, they had to hold up when Washington could come into town for the parade, because a British, not an officer, a soldier had decided to go to the top of a flagpole and tack up the Union Jack, the British flag, and the British colors, nailed them up there, and then greased the pole all the way down. And so it took an American to finally figure out that he had to nail some cleats to the side of it to get all the way up and tear down that last British flag before they would let Washington walk in. As the British left, they fired a shot, presumably in salute, perhaps not. But the British are finally gone. And Washington is in town for but a few days, because now the town has been restored. The Governor Clinton is now firmly ensconced again, and New York is now under American control. But he has a couple of things he has to do before he can go home. Remember, he had promised Martha, I don't know if you guys can recall back, but he sent a letter to Martha when he had first been made general. He said that he imagined he would be home by Christmas. And now he was kind of in a bit of a hurry, because we're in December. And so he wants to get home for Christmas, even if it is 8 years late. So he has a meeting, a dinner, they call it. Now remember, dinner in the 18th century happens around 2 in the afternoon. So he has a dinner at Fraunces Tavern in New York. Still there today. You can go to Fraunces Tavern in New York, and you can see the Long Room, which is where Washington had his dinner with his officers, which has come to be known as his farewell dinner. And he was meeting with them for the last time. Now remember, 18th century again, when you go back to your state, your home country, there is no reason to think that you will see any of these people again. They are from different states. Even if they were from Virginia, they could live a lot further away from Washington. He's going to be resigning his commission. He's going to be walking away from really being the most powerful person in America because, of course, he's at the head of a victorious army at this point. He gathers them together, and there's a lot of people that aren't there that you would think would be there. Lafayette has already gone back to France. Alexander Hamilton's in Congress. Isn't there? He's in Philadelphia. So, the people who are there, Henry Knox is there, Baron de Steuben, and there, Benjamin Talmadge is there. We don't know really the names of everyone, but we know that the officers that were still with him were at this dinner. And nobody's talking much and nobody's eating much, but he comes in and he pours a glass of Madeira, which was his favorite wine. And he raises his glass and he says, with a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take my leave of you. It is my most devout wish that your latter days may be as prosperous as happy as your former ones were honorable and glorious. Actually, I said that backwards, glorious and honorable. And Washington was known for not being a touchy-feely guy. But he turns and takes Henry Knox's hand and shakes his hand. And they embrace. They essentially hug. And the people in the room, they can't say anything because they're starting to cry again. Here they again, these officers that have seen so much that aren't going to see each other again in this life, they imagine. They can't keep their eyes dry. And he goes around and he says, I can't come to each of you, but I would be much obliged if each of you would come and take me by the hand. And he goes around and he shakes everybody's hands. Now, people from Virginia don't shake hands. They don't hug. They're very formal. They bow. And so this is an intimate moment that he takes with these men. As he finishes in the room, he leaves the room and they follow him in silence. All these officers down to the dock that's just 2 blocks away. And he boards a boat and he is rowed across towards New Jersey, where he will begin the journey to Maryland. Now, once he gets to Maryland, the Congress is very sure that they need to see a very specific type of resignation, and they write out all the forms of how he is to proceed, that he is to stand, that they will not stand, but he will stand, and he will give back his commission and resign as general. This is a very important moment for Congress because Congress is desperate to establish that they are in charge because, again, a lot of people are ready to see Washington in charge. But Washington is ready to be home. He's wanted to be home all this time. And so after 8 years, he returns his commission. He gets on his horse. He gives his farewell speech. He gets on his horse and he leaves. And he is able to arrive home just at sunset on Christmas Eve. Every light at Mount Vernon is on. When I say on, in every window they had put a light. And so he arrives at home. He's finally home for Christmas after 8 years. I'm sorry, but that always gets me. So, the war is over. Guys, we did it. We made it through the entire American Revolution. It only took us a year to do it. Well, a school year to do it. Essentially 9 months. And we had to skip a lot because there's a lot more to the story. There's some amazing stories in here. In fact, it wouldn't be fair not to close out some of these stories for you. We talked about John Laurens. Unfortunately, a year after Yorktown, well, not quite a year, but after Yorktown, he was involved in a battle where he was killed. So John Lawrence does not actually see the end of the war. Story resolution that we have here. You guys remember James Otis, the guy who first argued a man's home is his castle, a guy who argued against the writs of assistance, essentially kick-started this whole war because he started to argue about what their rights were. Unfortunately, James Otis does not live to see the final victory because he dies on May 23rd of 1783. He knows that victory is coming, at least they think he does. He declined further into mental illness, and he finally actually was struck by lightning and killed on the 23rd of May in 1783. Now, you guys remember Jonathan Greenwood? He was that little 16-year-old fifer who met up with the soldiers and joined the siege outside of Boston after Lexington and Concord. He was the one whose mother came and tried to get him to go back home, and he said no. And then, of course, I told you that later on he actually joined a crew of a letter of marque. It's I forget, privateer. He joins a privateer ship, and they have a big haul, so he made a lot of money, and he and his friend went out and bought their own ship, and then they promptly went out and were privateers and got caught. And so he was in prison. He was actually in prison twice. He ends up in New York City, even though it's all loyalists, and he escapes from the ship as a prisoner. He's supposed to be getting off there, and he quietly manages to make his way off as things are being unloaded. And he spends a little bit of time in New York, likes New York, but gets out of there, makes it back home. Well, after the war, he settled down a bit. He took up his father's trade. And this scrappy kid who kind of found his way throughout this American Revolutionary War, he becomes a dentist. He becomes a dentist in New York City. He becomes actually the dentist who first puts a drill and connects it to a foot treadle like a spinning wheel would be on, so that he can power the drill. And so he makes the first dental. He becomes known as the father of American dentistry. In fact, his cards say, because it's true, that he is the dentist to His Excellency President Washington. Once Washington is called back into service and made president. Washington was not excited about being president, by the way, though. That's another story for another class. But so yes, Jonathan Greenwood ends up being the dentist to the president. John Callender, you remember, the artilleryman who ran away at the Battle of Bunker Hill? Well, he, of course, as you know, served very well in New York. And at the Battle of Harlem Heights, he redeemed himself, proved himself to be a man of honor, and then was captured. He was released a year later, was reinstalled as a captain of the artillery, and he served throughout the rest of the war. I have evidence I have not been able to prove yet, but I have some evidence that he was one of the people who fired guns for Washington's birthday celebration years later. However, his main occupation did not stay with the Army. He left the Army, went back home to Boston, became a lawyer. Henry Knox, he went on to become our first Secretary of War. We would now refer that to the Secretary of Defense. But he was our first Secretary of War and served in Washington's cabinet. John Lawrence, we already talked about. You remember Charles Lee, that crazy general that had the dogs run after him and got caught early on, and then at the Battle of Monmouth started a retreat. Well, he lived after leaving the Army. He lived until 2nd of October, 1782. He did not see final victory, but that may be just as well, as papers that have been exposed in the years since then have shown that he was actually someone who, while he was a prisoner in Philadelphia, collaborated with the British and gave them a plan for how they could easily subdue all of the Americas. It is really questionable to where his loyalties lay. Um, and besides that, they may have threatened him because he had not properly resigned his commission in the British Army when he became an American general. So they may have been able to threaten him with what that meant. Nobody knows because, not enough information is left, but we do know that he certainly gave a frightening amount of collaboration. General Horatio Gates. Gates, who had had victory at Saratoga with the help of Benedict Arnold, who had failed so miserably at Camden, had been part of the Conway conspiracy and part of the Newburgh conspiracy. He was removed from command after the disastrous Battle of Camden. We knew that. His reputation destroyed militarily, and he did not hold another command for the remainder of the war as far as a field command. Gates retired to his Virginia estates after the war, but eventually moved to New York. He was elected to a single term in the New York State Legislature and died in 1806. Perhaps you remember Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert du Montier, Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette stayed in touch with Washington, was good friends with Washington, and actually made a trip, I believe it was 2 trips back to America. But in March of 1825, that would be 26 years after Washington has passed away, Lafayette began a tour of America. James Monroe, President James Monroe, and Congress invited Lafayette to visit the United States, and he did so. And he was followed everywhere. He was a major celebrity, hero of the Revolution. He went to Mount Vernon, visited Washington's grave. In fact, he did that with President Monroe. He would be escorted between cities by the state militia, and then he would enter each town through specially constructed arches of victory to be welcomed by local politicians and dignitaries, all eager to be seen with him. There would be special events, visits to battlefields and historic sites, celebratory dinners, and time set aside for the public to meet the legendary hero of the Revolution. He laid the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument in Massachusetts in June of 1825 after hearing an oration by Daniel Webster. He also took some soil from Bunker Hill. He took it and he kept it with him for the rest of his life because it was to be sprinkled on his grave when he passed away, which eventually it was. Now, mentioning someone else who was in his service, you remember James Armistead, the slave who had become the servant to Lafayette, who was very anti-slave himself, anti-slavery, I should say, not anti-slave, but and had become a spy that was a double agent back and forth for the Americans. Well, James Armistead, although Virginia passed a Manumission Act in 1782 allowing for the freedom of any slave who had fought in the Revolution, James Armistead remained the property of William Armistead because a 1783 law specifically freed only slaves whose owners had used them as substitutes for army service in exchange for their liberty. This was not the case for Armistead. He had been a spy, not a soldier. I know, that's just incredibly disheartening, isn't it? However, 3 years later in 1786, with the support of William Armistead, who was his master, who was then a member of the House of Delegates, and by a 1784 testimonial as to James Armistead's service under Lafayette, made by the Marquis himself, James petitioned the Virginia Assembly for his freedom, and on January 9th, 1787, the Assembly granted the petition. At that time, he changed his name. His name is James Armistead Lafayette, to honor the general. James Armistead Lafayette continued to live in New Kent County with his new wife. His previous wife had passed away, one son, and several other children, and became a wealthy farmer. In 1824, while in Richmond, the Marquis Lafayette was touring through and abruptly tells his carriage to stop, because he'd seen in the street James Armistead. And he opens the door to his carriage, rushes out in the crowd, and embraces him. And so they met again. Alexander Hamilton, you know what happened to him. He went on to become a person who was important in politics, including being the first Secretary of the Treasury, and he had certainly become, again, in the service of General Washington, now President Washington, although there are questions always that Alexander Hamilton would have risen much further had he not been quite as hot-tempered as he was. But, of course, he ends up dying in a duel later on. But there's a whole musical about that, so I don't need to tell you about that. Nathaniel Greene, you'll remember, he went on to become, he was considered a hero in South Carolina where he was given lands. And so after the war, he settled there on his farm with his wife, Kitty Greene, and his daughter, and I think also one son. But he is not built for that southern climate, actually. He gets heat stroke and passes away only a few years after the war. I think it's 87. No, it's earlier than that, come to think of it. I believe it's 86. But had he lived, he most likely would have become another one of Washington's cabinet. He could have easily become a politician, could have even run for president. I mean, well, in that time they wish it stood for president. John Adams, you know what becomes of him. He becomes another president of the United States, first a vice president and then the second president of the United States. General de Steuben became a U.S. citizen by act of the Pennsylvania legislature in March of 1784. He served as the president of the German Society in the city of New York, a charitable society founded in 1784 to assist German immigrants. Von Steuben was present at the first inauguration of George Washington in New York City in 1789. Yes, Washington was going to end up back in New York and then back in Philadelphia for 8 more years of service, even though the whole time he just wanted to be home. Guys, it has been a year, and we'll have the final next week, however that shapes up. And it has been a delight to teach you this year. I'm sorry that this last semester has been such a strange one that we haven't met in person, but we made it through the war. Congratulations. You're now Revolutionary War scholars, and we'll talk to you next week. Have a good one.